The early days of Jim Jones in the People's Temple. Jim Jones grew up poor in Lynn, Indiana, and from an early age, he had an interest in ministering and preaching. It was said as a child he would preach to his friends, and by the age of 16, he was a street preacher in poor black communities. In 1956, after honing his skills and studying under the likes of Father Divine, Jim Jones established his racially integrated church, the People's Temple. Establishing a church so racially diverse in the climate of the 50s and 60s was unheard of. Jim even took it a step further and adopted a black child, being the first Caucasian family to adopt a black child in the state of Indiana. This earned Jim a lot of recognition and credibility, and in 1960, he was appointed to the Human Rights Commission. There, he fought against racial injustice and for racial equality. Jim Jones had a message of socialism, racial equality, and revolution, intertwined with his own version of the gospel and practicing fake healings. The mix of his revolutionary message that completely fit the times, alongside the myth that he was a healer and a prophet, drew in people of every background, creed, and color by the groves. And as his fame grew, so did his paranoia and his abuse of power, leading him farther and farther away from the teachings of the Bible. He began to see himself as God, and his people began to call him Father.
Representative of the I Am, as Jehovah Jireh. Some people see a great deal of God in my body. They see Christ in me, a hope of glory.
Inside the People's Temple. In 1965, after reading an article in the Esquire magazine about the atomic apocalypse and where to survive, Jim Jones decided to move his faithful congregation of 140 people to Redwoods Valley, California. There, they established a commune and started to grow their own food and would take busloads of people across the country to recruit more members. Initially, Jim Jones funded the People's Temple with the sale of exotic animals, but now he called for them to give up everything they owned, their houses, and their businesses. While in Redwoods Valley, Jim Jones also turned darker, and as the congregation grew into the thousands, he demanded more from his members. They were forced to work long hours. He would humiliate and beat them in front of the other members, isolate them from their family and friends, and would threaten to kill them if they decided to leave. All this while gaining fame in local politics. At the height of the People's Temple, 75% of his members were African American. And Jim Jones would move his congregation, now in the thousands, to San Francisco. In San Francisco, the People's Temple became a group dedicated to community activism. They would establish programs to get people out of jail, feeding the homeless, and would participate in organizing for local elections. All of this while Jim made his congregation free sexually and would have sex with both male and female members of his church. Even with all this going on, he still became one of the faces of the San Francisco community, becoming a member of the Housing Authority, running in circles with the prominent members in politics, and even commanding a private audience with Jimmy Carter's wife. As his power grew, so did his paranoia. He would become hooked on drugs and often test his members with mock suicides.
By the time Jones did come out to do his speaking, the table had already been set.
I represent divine principle, total equality, a society where people own all things in common, where there is no rich or poor, where there are no races. Wherever there's people struggling for justice and righteousness, there I am, and there I am involved.
Edie, fingers, are your fingers numb? In your right hand. Reach the fingers out that are bothering you. Now, is the pain gone? What have we done in a short time? We have 4 senior citizen homes that are the most innovating, the most beautiful you want to see.
In an environment where you're constantly up, you're constantly busy, and you're made to feel guilty if you take too many luxuries like sleeping, you tend to not really think for yourself. And I did allow Jones to think for me. because I figured that he had the better plan. I gave my rights up to him, as many others did.
Felt he could tie them to him, both kind of organizationally and also romantically.
He would say, I want every person in this room who has had sex with me to stand up. And maybe a couple of people would be really shy and they'd sit down. He says, now I want everybody, and he'd point to the person, I want you to stand up and admit to this. And so everybody in the room who had sex with him would have to stand up.
We had guards constantly around the church. We were constantly watched when we'd go to school or whatever. Hey, we were afraid to talk to our own parents, because when we did, we were turned in for being negative.
Things got bad gradually. First they started whippings with a belt, a few whacks, and for minor infractions such as drinking and smoking or being late for work. Then they went to the board. To leave People's Temple, you have to decide you'd rather die than go back, because they threatened to kill all traitors. When we left, we had all kinds of threatening phone calls, threatening letters.
From as early as 1973, Jim Jones has started making concessions with the Guyanese government to clear land for his own town in the middle of the jungle. And as early as 1975, he began to send members there to start clearing the land under the guise of an agricultural project. At the height of Jim Jones's popularity in San Francisco, a San Francisco newspaper released condemning evidence about what was really going on in People's Temple. After this, in 1977, Jim Jones started to convince his members to move to his socialist utopia he dubbed Jonestown. Almost overnight, he began to fly his dedicated members to Guyana. Many left without notifying their family. Once the members reached Guyana, their passports were taken and all of their currency. Jonestown was completely isolated and hard to escape. The Jonestown Massacre. Although some viewed Jonestown as a utopia, others saw it as a prison camp and a plantation. The people were forced to work long hours. Jim Jones' frantic voice would instill fear in them throughout the day and night over the radio, and he would constantly practice suicides, which he called the White Night. Eventually word got out, and Congressman Leo Ryan, alongside concerned family members and the media, went to visit Jonestown. On the first day of November 17th, they were met with praise. But as people stated they wanted to leave, the tides quickly turned. Leo Ryan was murdered at an airstrip along with a few other defectors trying to go back to the U.S. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones was preparing a combination of cyanide and Kool-Aid for his congregation. Unknown to the majority of their congregation, Jim Jones had been purchasing cyanide 2 years prior to his so-called revolutionary suicide. On that day, November 18th, he made the children go first. There were 303 children who lost their lives that day. The adults went next, and those who didn't want to lose their lives were held down and injected. Jim Jones himself never took the poison and died from a gunshot wound to the head. Over 900 people either committed suicide or were murdered that day, and at least 300 of them were buried in a mass grave in California, mostly children. And let's not forget, African Americans made up 75% of his congregation. Know your history. The reason I took so much time on the People's Temple is because there's so much we need to understand. This group was formed at a time when civil rights was at the forefront, when racial injustice was the main conversation, when the FBI was targeting organizations fighting for change, when our most powerful leaders were being murdered, and when people came together, were shut down and killed by an evil government, and when racial integration was nearly a dream. Many of those in People's Temple wanted a way out, a way for change and a better world, and their good intentions was manipulated and turned on them. They wanted a stake in something. So in this time of social media influencers and false narratives, we need to take time to understand that we can all be deceived, that we should never put our faith in one leader or organization, that we should think for ourselves and find joy and solace in each other.